Welcome to this edition of the Beef Roundtable. Today we will be talking with our guest about beef demand and what it means to the beef industry. I'm Dr. Ron Lemonade, your beef extension specialist at Purdue University, West Lafayette, Indiana, and I'll be working with my co-host, Burt Rutherford.
And I'm Burt Rutherford, senior editor at Beef Magazine, and I'm here in Denver, Colorado. Each month on the Beef Roundtable, we discuss topics that are important to beef producers, and we invite guests, experts in those particular areas to join us for that discussion.
The Beef Roundtable is recorded live and edited to fit the time constraints of the program. The programs are available at the Beef Magazine website, iTunes, YouTube.com, as well as www.beefroundtable.com.
Our first guest for today's Beef Roundtable is Dawn Caldwell. Dawn grew up in south central Nebraska on a diversified farm that included an Angus cow-calf herd. Now she and her husband have a cow-calf operation and are parents of two, both of whom are students at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. In addition to the cow-calf herd, they background their calves in preparation for a trip to the feed yard. Dawn's active in both 4-H and FFA. She served on the Nebraska Beef Council, the Nebraska Farm Bureau, and on the NCBA Federation of State Beef Councils Executive Committee.
Our second guest is Dr. Glenn Tonser, a professor in ag economics at Kansas State University in Manhattan. His current efforts are devoted to extension activities and research in a broad area of beef cattle production, consumer demand, and supply levels. His research and thoughts are often quoted in the livestock media, and he's spoken at a number of industry events.
Glenn, let's start off our discussion by defining beef demand. What is it, and how do you measure it?
Sure, I'm happy to do that, Bert. It's a very confusing concept throughout the entire industry. A lot of folks associate beef demand with per capita consumption, and I'll respectfully note that's where the confusion starts. So I'm going to tell you what beef demand is by first telling you what it is not, because that's the most common view. Per capita consumption is just availability of beef. So the amount of beef we produce, adjusted for trade, divided by the U.S. population, gives us per capita beef availability. And because beef, like many other proteins, is pretty valuable, we tend not to waste it. So what's available, we consume. And that's how you can work your way towards what is demand. Demand is really the value of a product, and in this case, beef. So how does the public, the U.S. public in particular, value our beef products? That's what we're talking about when we talk about beef demand, not per capita consumption, because that's an availability measure. It's really the combination of what's available and the price that consumers are willing to pay that tell analysts like me how strong beef demand is. For those that are a little geekier, beef demand is really a schedule of how many pounds the U.S. public will purchase at given prices. So if you increase the price, how much less will they purchase? If you decrease the price, how much more will they purchase? There's a lot of things that go into changing that over time we're going to talk about in this segment, but my main point is beef demand tells us the value the public places into the beef products, not just the volume that's consumed.
So Dawn, as a cow-calf producer and as a backgrounder, why do you think beef demand is important at the ranch level?
Well, if you put that all in perspective and go off of what Glenn said there, price is a big piece of that. And I think the vast majority, if not all, cow-calf folks really do what we do because we love what we do, but at the same time we're trying to earn a living. And that price does trickle down to us as cow-calf producers. So you know, we need every segment of the industry to do well, and the more consumers that are willing to pay a little bit more for their beef, the better it is for each segment. So for us, it's all part of earning a living and having people want to buy what we're making.
So, Ron, I might add to that briefly here, is one of the studies that I'll call him my economic predecessors, John Marsh, worked a long time at Montana State. He's no longer an active faculty member, but he studied these issues a long time. And this is now a dated study, but one of the reports he put out was the notable beef demand decline that occurred through the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. He quantified the price and volume impact that had both at the fed cattle as well as the feeder cattle level. So he gave us some estimates, at least at that time, of how changes in retail beef demand impacted the cow-calf sector. And much like Don said, it shouldn't surprise us, that notable beef demand decline over that period, which granted this sounds like a history lesson, but there's a lot you can learn from this, was there was a 10% reduction in cow-calf prices over that period that could be associated simply because of the beef demand decline. So I can make this geekier than that, but it's been quantified over time that at the cow-calf level, prices received are a direct function of the strength of U.S. beef demand.
Glenn and Dawn, let's follow that up a little bit. If we look out over here the next couple of years, it looks like we're going to have greater cattle supplies and therefore more beef production. It also looks like we're going to have more pork production, and so those competing meats are going to be going head to head with each other in both in food service and at the grocery store. Taking a look ahead a little bit, what's your take on that? How can the beef industry, how can we stay competitive in that kind of an environment?
I can take a stab at that first if you want me to. So a couple things to consider is, first of all, every time the beef checkoff makes an effort in reaching out to consumers and learning from them what they appreciate most about beef, or what one of their greatest factors in purchasing is, aside from price, it is taste. Consumers genuinely love the taste of beef, and not that they don't incorporate all meats into their families' dinners and diets. However, beef is something that's really it's a celebration meal, and we want it to not only be a celebration meal. So we're constantly working on recipes and cookery methods and different things that we're getting out to help people appreciate what they could do at home. The second thing I would say is, in talking about that celebration aspect of beef and consumers purchasing it, more people are eating at home versus the restaurant these days, and that isn't necessarily a concern, but it's an opportunity for us to make sure that we're offering products in the meat case at the grocery stores that consumers want to buy. And so there's a lot of really exciting work going on via the beef checkoff, as well as industry partners right now, food service industry partners, restaurant industry partners, grocery industry partners, to create meal opportunities for people that they can enjoy at home and not have that risk of capitalizing on one of their concerns that they've always had in purchasing beef, which is they spend a little bit more money and then they ruin it when they cook it. They're scared of cooking it wrong and wasting their money. So we're working very hard at helping them to not have that happen. So I think there's a lot of work and opportunity in the beef checkoff to be done, and a lot of work has been done in terms of looking out that 3 and 5 years to make sure that we have what consumers are going to want on their plates and in their homes.
I would agree with everything that Dawn outlined there. As the geeky economist, it's my job to maybe muddy that up a little bit. And I'll just go further and say that everything that was shared there by Dawn, I concur with, and it applies in some national aggregate sense. But we also live in a country that's very, very diverse, and that's a beautiful part about being in America. You know, there's over 330 million folks here, very diverse views, preferences, household situations, you name it. It's hard to find a lot of households that are quote unquote the same. And I think that's very important that everybody, in particular in this case, beef strategic planning, keep in mind. The value of time and what that means for convenience of products differs across households. So if you have a dual income household, there's less interest in preparing meals in a quote unquote traditional sense than somebody else where it might be a household where there's a single income, as a simple example. Another example would be, I'll actually note a study recently completed, myself and Ted Schroeder, that was Checkoff funded as well, that was trying to monitor beef demand in a new way. And one of the things that came from that study was patterns in demand of beef vary regionally around this country. And specific to one of your questions was, what's the competing meat effect here? We actually found that pork price effects matter in 2 of the 4 regions. They matter in the South and the Midwest, and they do not have a significant impact on beef demand in the West and the Northeast. So I offer that as an example to where I'm a firm believer competing meats matter, but the magnitude to which they matter, and therefore the magnitude we should be concerned about these growing competing supplies, is not universally the same across the country.
I think that's really important information to know as we move forward in selecting future contracts for the beef checkoff. Something else that we have to keep in mind is not only domestic preference and domestic demand, but also international, because this week's updated numbers that we received, we're still broaching that $300 per head value in exports. So making sure that people around the globe want to consume U.S. beef is really important to continuing success for our business.
Let me ask a follow-up question. When you were talking, a number popped back in my head, and somewhere along the way, I heard that a typical consumer would buy either 3, maybe 4 cuts of meat, okay, in the grocery store, and partly because they didn't know how to cook the other ones, or maybe they didn't have a good experience with another one, or whatever. How do we address, Dawn, you talked about recipes and meal solutions, and Glenn, you kind of talked about kind of that food service, retail, okay, regional differences. Is there anything we can do? Are we making progress, I guess, with the consumer moving beyond those 3 or 4 cuts that they have historically bought?
I would say yes, and one of the key things that's really helping with that right now is working with the meat departments at their retail sites and encouraging them to push, and we're also digitally pushing the interactive butcher counter. So if they are promoting a certain cut at a special value that week, and it's not a cut a consumer has typically been comfortable in cooking, perhaps it's something from the round, so it has turned out tough or dry for them in the past, they can go to the interactive butcher counter on beefitswhatsfordinner.com and learn all the different ways they could prepare that for their family, and perhaps even turn it into 2 or 3 meals from one purchase. Then it becomes a much greater value for them, and they have a much higher success as they prepare it for their family to enjoy. So things like that that consumers can YouTube or search or Google, we're investing to make sure that pops up first, as well as having influencers and people in the meat industry help get that out to consumers for us and alongside us, because the more people know about it, the more are using it and really happy with that information that's out there.
And I'll actually back us up a step in the production chain, and we can make these strategic investments and efforts at the retail level, like Don alluded to, and I think they're very smart. But we also have to recognize the entire industry already does something before we get to that point. So we have a certain amount of products that are directed towards retail, others that are directed towards food service, and as Don alluded, some are being exported. Well, let's focus domestically on that retail versus food service side of things. Sometimes it's easier to steer some of those products that maybe there's less average consumer purchaser knowledge on towards the food service channel, where those folks may know more about how to prep something, might have more expertise, ability to change a ingredient list, incorporate it as an ingredient into a meal, those kind of things. Sometimes I think it's actually easier to target those new efforts towards the food service side, where there's quite honestly, a little bit more knowledge and a willingness to adjust how we do things. The nice thing about that is, whether you add the value by enhancing value food service or you do a retail side, the net of that increases wholesale beef value, which all the way back to cow-calf price level is good for everybody in the chain. So whether we redirect products across channel or we, within a channel, enhance demand, they both raise the tide of all in the industry.
Glenn, whenever you did your study, did you look at differences between regions in terms of what beef products they were more apt to buy? Was there differences there?
So there was a host of things we looked at in that study, and for those that want details, I would encourage them to contact me and I'll get it to you, but also the make sure I say it right.
mybeefcheckoff.com. Yep.
I'll make sure it's .com. Resource has that report as well as related things. But to answer your question, the region-specific analyses were what I still call beef in aggregate. As a sidebar, we did additional stuff that was more kind of in the weeds, and that gets real messy, and I don't want to overload people with those details. We did some national work that compared, for example, ground beef demand with loin demand, tried to estimate rib demand and so forth. And there are different patterns based upon the product. For example, ground beef demand was stronger for a longer period in recent years than loin demand. And I think that's interesting to pause and maybe recognize why that was going on. There's a bit of we've always liked our hamburger in this country, but there's a bit of a renaissance on it. And, the gourmet burgers and all those kind of things are very strong and very supportive. And I think understanding what's underneath that is critical. We documented it exists. Our recent study wasn't really trying to answer why that was happening. That's really a determinants of beef demand question, which we could talk about going forward. My understanding is that's on the horizon for more checkoff-oriented research.
So
Something else I would say. Oh, I'm sorry. Should I go ahead? Going further with what Glenn talked about, and especially in the food service industry, whether that food service is something that's become very popular at grocery stores, having the cafeteria type atmosphere in a grocery store, or if it's at schools, military, hospitals, etc. Producers should be on the lookout for some new and exciting things that are coming in that regard in terms of packaging and cooking methods and full meal opportunities, because we have some really cool stuff coming down the road that I don't even, as a Beef Checkoff board member, get to know the full details on yet, but I've been given some exciting news that there's cool stuff coming. So in this next 12 months, we're going to have a real opportunity for convenience in all of those aspects.
Dawn, let me interrupt at this point. Can you move a little to your left?
Yes.
Yep. We're losing you out of the frame there. All right. Thank you. Okay.
Now I got fuzzy. There it goes better again. Okay.
Okay. Just kind of as a follow-up to the follow-up to the follow-up, my two daughters both grew up in Texas and have moved since to Colorado. And one of their greatest frustrations is that you can't buy a brisket anywhere in the state of Colorado. And so Glenn, back to what you were talking about, those regional differences, we tend to be fairly mobile people, and we move around a bit, and people from different parts of the country tend to get relocated. This might be a bit of a trivial offshoot, but how does that affect those regional differences? How does my poor, deprived daughter find a brisket?
Yeah, Bert, that's a good question. I'm not sure I have a complete answer for you, because I do agree that we are increasingly mobile. A household that was originally in Texas, moves to Colorado, is going to have a different set of options, exactly like you said. But parts of this I don't think change. And I'll highlight another one of our findings to maybe make that point, is not only did we find that the spillover of pork price matters in two regions but not others, so pork is more of a competing meat in two of the four regions was the point of that. We also found that what I call the seasonality of beef demand was very different. And in particular, on the West Coast and the Northeast, the quote-unquote bump up in the summer was stronger. So there was more seasonal variation on the West Coast and the Northeast than there was in the Midwest and the South. And I think that's part of grilling and the interaction between that and weather, right? So if you're sitting in New York, there's a certain period of the time that you can grill. That's a very different time period than if you're in South Texas, back to your story, or Florida or somewhere else. And I don't think that changes with who is there, right? If I'm in Texas versus New York, weather dictates what months are eligible to grill in, and I think that's going to forever be the case. So parts of these regional differences, I think, are quote-unquote long-term and there to stand. Other things might change a little bit as we have more mobile populations.
I might just add one thing, and we grill 12 months out of the year, so we don't have a specific grilling season. So sometimes you get a little bit chilly whenever you're grilling a steak, but that still happens. But
not everybody's as loyal as we are.
We appreciate you for doing that too.
So let's go back to the idea of competing meats for just a second. I think we could, Glenn, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we could expect that the pork and poultry industries are probably going to increase in supply as well, okay, over the next reasonably short time frame. So what does that really mean to our beef industry, and how do we compete better? And maybe, Dawn, you may have already answered that by some of the new things that are coming down the pike, and maybe if we can get retail and food service to modify just a little bit. But any thoughts on that?
Sure, I'll take a first stab at it. As I don't think it's coming down the pike. I think, Ron, it's already here. So in 2016, early 2017, we already have a lot more beef, pork, chicken supplies in the system, and that's part of the broader story of why the cattle prices are not what they were 2 or 3 years ago. I won't belabor that, but I think the situation you're describing is already here and will be here for the next couple of years. What does that mean? I'm alluding to the fact that I think it means different things around the country. I think in the past we've presumed that there's a competing meat effect, and we've kind of treated it as uniform around the country. I'm driving the point home. I don't think it's uniform, but I'll actually go a little bit further. When you look at the literature, it appears to me, just looking at studies over time, that economists' estimates of how sensitive beef demand is to pork or chicken price are actually declining over time. Now, this warrants direct assessment. I'm just telling you it's an observation from the literature. But it's possible that the public's willingness to shift from one meat to the other is not quite what it once was. I personally think that's the case. As the value of time for the average person that works and is busy has grown, this is part of the demand for convenience, I think their willingness to substitute ingredients and at the extreme go from species to species A to species B may have slowed down some. So I think competing meat effects are real, but I honestly think maybe we overreact to them. I think there's some more loyalty, both good and bad, for the beef industry than maybe there was in the past, because people have stronger habits, value their time. To your point earlier, they buy 3 or 4 cuts, they don't buy 13 and take them home and figure out what to do. So I think there's a whole host of those things that aren't fully appreciated. Yes, we need to appreciate competing meat supplies are growing, but I think we should back up and ask an even more basic question: is the impact of those as strong as we once thought?
Something I would add to that, because everything that I just heard was very accurate, and I think the perfect question to ask. And in numbers I saw just recently, it's not an overwhelming added consumption per person when we look at each of the proteins. So when we look at total meat production in the U.S., if we would stay at similar population and added production, then we're only looking at an increase of 7 pounds per person potentially. Well, consider added exports, consider more people purchasing because of that change in loyalties or added loyalties, whichever families choose that Glenn just talked about, to various different proteins. And I think we'll be okay. It wasn't as alarming as what maybe we were seeing 6 and 8 and 10 months ago when we were looking at this wall of meat that we have coming, and not just beef, but all proteins. So I think it's less overwhelming to when you look at it in pounds per person than it was at one time.
Yeah, and I think that's very important for everybody to keep in mind. It's easy for us to lose sight because we talk about how many more cows there are in the system, or how many more sows there are, or whatever statistic you want to talk about. And there's a long-term interest in growing the amount of meat that is produced in this country. But what really matters is how much is available per person and what the value of that is. So our whole discussion here is demand-oriented, and Dawn hit on it, in spades. Keeping that on a per person or potentially a per household basis is very important, because we're going to continue to have population growth. So you would expect for supplies to go up. What matters is what's the value that's associated with that, and we have to keep all that in context.
Yep, and then just to circle back around the global demand, so keeping in the back of our mind also that, and Glenn, you'll correct me on this, 94%-ish of the population lives outside the U.S. borders. That's a lot of export potential. So keeping our people in the U.S. happy and content with plenty of beef on their plates, and then having a great export market helps as well.
Yeah, Ron, I'll interject one more. Is historically the U.S. beef industry has been very reliant, both blessed and reliant, on the domestic beef consumer. Just as a rule of thumb, about 10% of what we produce is exported. It's varied over time. After the BSE event, we export a lot less. But in general, we've not exported more than 10% of our production. So most of those pounds have stayed at home. Most folks, including myself, see the big opportunities are to increase. Seizing those opportunities abroad, as Don said, is not just the population growth. It's the population coupled with the expectation of income growth, and therefore a move up in meat demand, a desire to, and an ability to afford. more expensive, more valuable, more preferred meat proteins, that's where the international opportunity is, and that stands to benefit U.S. cattlemen.
Well, and to add to that, a lot of that 10% that we export is products that we in the United States don't really readily consume, like tongues and tripe and some of those things that are considered delicacies or high-end value in other countries. So it's not all of our steaks and roasts that are going out of the country. It's a lot of the product that the different regions that you've covered by your study really are not interested in buying.
I use the specific example. I personally would not pay maybe anything, but definitely not a premium for beef tongue. It's just not personally of something I prefer. Now, I could afford it. It's available. I choose not to. But there are folks in other countries, Japan in that example, that will pay a premium for it. And I think that's wonderful. Those are markets working. That's an example of diverse consumers. Another consumer values that product more than I do. Let them buy it. The net of that is the beef producer benefits by producing an animal that produces a whole host of diverse products. And if we have open trade and more, let's just call it rational marketing of our products, the sum of the value of those is a lot greater than if you make everybody consume all the products from a steer. So that's the big benefit of trade. This isn't a trade session. I don't want to get too far in the weeds on that. But to your point, it's not just 10% of everything off every steer and heifer in the system. It's a very targeted set of products that are worth more abroad than they are here at home.
Yeah,
I guess one thing I would add to that, having traveled to both Europe and Asia for beef trade trips and just visiting with the people there about what they like, and it wasn't necessarily about trade. Like Glenn says, we don't want to get in the weeds on that, but wanting to know what they like about our beef and what they appreciate about our beef, just to share with the producers here at home. When they go to the grocery store and they don't see the price of their prime rib and their T-bone and their strips coming down as much as they think they should based on what the value of our live animals has gone down, there is a tremendous demand for those high quality cuts as well. So we have the unique cuts or parts of the animal that do well in other countries, such as the tongue, the tripe, and so on. But they also really, really like our middle meats, and so that keeps the price high here in addition to other countries.
And I think that points out what Glenn started out by saying, which is demand is a very complicated thing to try to take on. And we have to sell the whole animal. And so, when you talk about adding value to what beef producers do, clearly that export market adds value. Oftentimes we may not see it directly in hard dollars, but the value is really definitely there.
Yeah, and Bert, I don't know if this will help, but when I'm often asked, and actually I was asked earlier and I'm not sure I answered it, but how we measure beef demand, the way I try to synthesize that without equations and geeky numbers is we compare what we expect the public will pay for beef products versus what we observe they pay. And if they end up paying more than we quote unquote expected, then I know beef demand improved. Okay? So if somebody is willing to pay $8 for a product, but I expected them to pay $7, I know something is improved in that product, right? Or potentially their consumer incomes are up, or something has enhanced beef demand. Maybe it's more valuable to them in the sense it's more convenient, or they're more assured of the safety, or whatever it could be. But at the end of the day, what I'm doing is comparing the expected price that I think they're going to pay with what we observe them paying. So that's one way to get your arms around what this means. And the reason I kind of leave us with that is nowhere in there did I say anything about per capita consumption. That's embedded in my expectation exercise, but you're not really talking about whether or not the poundage went up. We're really talking about whether the price they paid was higher or lower than we anticipated it would be.
Great. Ron, any follow-up questions you might have?
Now, folks, I really appreciate your insight and the comments that you've made, because I think it's spot on, and I think it helps me as well as other producers understand this whole concept of beef demand a little bit better. So that about wraps up this edition of the Beef Roundtable. Please join us again next month for another look at important issues that are and trends that are affecting you, the producer.